Hello, everyone. I'm Deepa Visvanathan from the Department of Languages and Linguistics, University Tunku Abdul Rahman, Perak campus. The title of my presentation today is an investigation of syntactic impairment in relative clauses of a non-fluent aphasic patient. Non-fluent aphasia or broadcast aphasia is basically a type of language disorder. And apparently Paul Preyer-Bocca actually was the neurosurgeon. He basically first discovered in 1861 that broadcast area in human brain, all right, seemed to be very much crucial and important in speech production, right? Apparently, if there is a damage in broadcast area in a human, all right, that particular individual will not have the ability to understand complex sentences. An example of complex sentences is that, like for an example, if the sentence structure seem to have semantically reversible structure, right? So these particular group of people who happen to have lesion in broadcast area will have difficulties understanding them. Their speech will be very much slow and non-fluent, and responses that they make eventually will make sense, but they will be ungrammatical at times. Non-fluent aphasia, also known as broadcast aphasia, can also be basically be regarded be regarded as a grammatic aphasia. They seem to have a poor reputation ability, and overall, it can be clearly stated that broadcast area and also vernix area, okay, seem to be they seem to be a very important language areas that is very much significant in humans' ability to comprehend and also produce language. So the background to the study is very much relevant to to look at. It's very much relevant to broadcast aphasic patient, or also known as non-fluent aphasic patient, right? So here, if you look at this current study, actually the main focus is that we would want to go about, the researcher would want to go about looking at the typical characterization of how non-fluent aphasic patients will eventually comprehend complex sentences, which is semantically reversible sentences. So as we all know that broadcast area is the neurocenter for speech production, and it's independent of speech comprehension, all right? Kampar and also Zurich in 1967, they claimed that non-fluent aphasic broca area actually, all right, they found that the patient actually seemed to have some sort of like impairment in that particular area, and lead to the conclusion that the deficit actually has resulted to a significant impairment on their ability to go about comprehending sentence structures and also on their production skills. So having said that, it can be very much be relevant to Grodzinski's hypothesis that has got to do with the trace duration hypothesis that argues that their syntactical ability is very much intact. But the one thing that is only missing during the comprehension process is that the trace, which means when I talk about semantically reversible sentences, if there is a movement in the internal structure of English sentence structures, then the movement will eventually leave a trace, and that trace will eventually be deleted, all right, will be deleted during the process of comprehension. So here, patients will automatically assign thematic roles to the non-thematic position, which means they would basically be using a type of strategy known as default strategy, okay, where they will be assigning the first NP that they see in the central structure, assigning the role of agent to the first NP that they see in the sentence structure, right? So therefore, it is the main aim of this study actually it is to investigate the typical characterizations of the syntactic impairment in the different relative clauses, okay, found in a patient diagnosed with non-fluent aphasia, and assess the empirical validity of Grodzinski's PDH using semantic reversible sentences, using relative clauses as a stimulus. So the research objective for this particular study is that to identify the performance level, to identify whether they fall under the category of chance, above chance, or below chance, all right? And also to analyze their syntactical representations of these reversible sentences of subject relative and also object relative clauses, right? So if you look at these studies conducted in Malaysia on aphasia, they are very much limited. if you look at studies that adopts Broadzinki's 1990 TDH is very much limited, all right, and involving Malaysian speaker of English. Yes, if you look at Aman Shahami in 2004, he conducted a case study where he basically analyzed conversations between student clinicians with the aphasic patients. Chiang in 2005, she conducted a case study also, where she conducted the study on Malay grammatic speaker. Hassan, 2008, he basically investigated on the factors that affecting their sentence comprehension, particularly focusing in Malay language. Training in 2009, basically he explored the residual ability of patients with aphasia in reading and comprehending concrete nouns. Muhammad Sabri, 2011, conducted a case study on verbal retrieval and sentence production of Malay speakers of fluent aphasia. And finally, Jalil in 2011, he basically conducted a research that could possibly help one to disrupt the development of semantic battery in Malay. So what we can conclude here is that most of the focus of the previous studies actually has been on Malay language. So I could possibly say that there is a limited study in Malaysia, particularly involving Malaysian speaker of English. So if you look at the conceptual framework of the study, so the main theory that the current study adapts will be the government and binding theory that typically will focus on two levels of representations. One is known as deep structure that has a specific focus on semantic representation that has a clear focus on the meaning of the sentence structure. Surface structure is basically the internal structure of how the sentences will eventually be constructed. So within this theory, actually, when we look at the most influential theory of looking at a grammatics comprehension, we have to go about talking about this trace division hypothesis. So according to this hypothesis, we know that all traces of movement will eventually be deleted. That is what I highlighted initially. Okay, when it is deleted, automatically they cannot recognize the so-called the function of the noun phrases that happen to be in the particular sentence. This particular claim actually, or particularly this particular hypothesis is very much embedded in the government binding theory, which is within the transformational grammar that has specific focus on deep structure and surface structure. So the current study will focus on constructing semantic reversible sentences that has a specific focus on the two types of sentence structure. One is known as the subject verb object sentence structure, focus will be on subject relative clauses, and another type will be the object subject verb sentence structure that will be on object relative clauses. So when we look at the sentence constructions here, of course, these will eventually be constructed accordingly, where a particular test will be adapted and adopted. And when we look at the score obtained, and all right, we could possibly go about looking or be able to talk about their ability, all right, with regards to the hypothesis and also the theory as our framework to go about explaining their syntactical ability in making sure they could possibly understand or comprehend, all right, a specific sentence structure. So the methodology of this study actually is I selected the samples, all right, based on the availability of the so-called patient. So since there's a very much limited patients available in Malaysia, so I would just proceed conducting a case study research design, case study as my research design. And I only selected one non-fluent aphasic patient from National Association Stroke of Malaysia, NAS in Petaling Jaya. So adapted and adopted Christensen's 2001 sentence to picture matching test. And if you look at the text, there will be a picture, picture A and picture B, and I have a total of 8 sets of picture that has different verb and action. So if you look at this construction of the sentence, I just took one of the examples. I choose, I would want to go about constructing semantic reversible sentences because we are dealing with complex sentences. So I will be constructing 2 examples of sentences for each type. So the girl that pushes the boy that pushes the girl will eventually belong to subject relative clause, and it will also, and of course, another 2 example of sentences will be constructed for the object relative clause. So there will be a total of 32 semantic reversible sentences that has 8 different actions or verbs, right? So the data collection of this particular study, the procedure actually is that I will be presenting, I presented these 2 pictures semantically mirrored to each other to the patient. And the patient basically heard the sentence structures and will be required to point out the big picture that depicts the meaning of the sentence. Of course, the sentence structures will be read out aloud, all right? And then, of course, the patient would eventually want to go about pointing out the pictures that depicts the meaning. So this has got to do with the so-called first level of presentation, which is the deep structure. And of course, after assessing them, all right, as they point out the correct pictures, scores will eventually be calculated, right? So, like, of course, after calculating the average percentage, there were 2 attempts actually, right? 2 attempts, and the scores obtained from each attempt will eventually be calculated, and the average percentage obtained from the test will be basically be tabulated. Okay, so the syntactic representation of the so-called sentence structures, which is the relative clauses, will be basically be explained in detail, all right, when we conduct a grammatical analysis. So having said that, all right, one set of feature that belong to a certain verb will basically be be analyzed, and of course this analysis will be very much influenced with Chomsky's GB theory and also their transformational grammar theory, where we'll be looking at their deep structure and surface structure. So these syntactical representations of object relative and subject relative clauses will be displayed and will be explained accordingly based on the hypothesis and also on the theory. As for the performance level, the patient's performance level will be identified based on Rodzinski's 1990 standard norm, right? So this is the result and discussion for the first RO, the performance level. So if you look at the performance level of the patient, for the first attempt for subject relative clause, and also the second attempt, this patient happened to be scoring the similar points, 13 out of 16. So this has eventually led to the overall average percentage of 81 that falls under the above chance performance level. As for the object relative clauses, the first attempt was 10 out of 16, and the second attempt was 9 out of 16. So here, this led to the average percentage of 59 overall, and is compared, and if you can see, the performance level for object relative clause is chance performance level. So if you look at table 2, the non-fluent patient's performance level and average percentage in comparison with Rodzinski's 1990 standard norm. So as you can see, it can be clearly seen that both subject relative clauses and object relative clauses, okay, the patient happened to fall within, and it corresponds with the standard norm, with the Rodzinski's standard norm, where both clauses actually fall within the so-called range set by Rodzinski's in 1990. This shows that trace deletion hypothesis can definitely be used as one of the most influential theories or hypotheses to go about making sure that, or to explain a grammatic's ability to comprehend sentence structures. Okay, right. The second research objective that has got to do with the syntactic representation, grammatical analysis was conducted, right? So if you look at the D structure that has got to do with the meaning, deep structure, and also, all right, this is how typically a sentence structure will be arranged before the inclusion of grammatical elements. So this is where the affixes will be situated. The boy that kissed the girl, right? So as for the OVS, the boy kissed the girl, and this is where the affixes will be situated. So when there is involvement of surface structure, the second level of presentation, this is where the inclusion of grammatical elements will come into play. So this is where the affixes will eventually be transformed to the verb, and it becomes kisses. So automatically, when there is a movement, there will be a trace here. If there is a trace, okay, this trace will automatically be deleted, okay? And of course, this phrase, the boy that, actually will eventually be positioned in a different positions, and that is why there is a trace here. So this symbol actually indicates a trace that the element has left out. All right. So if you can see, according to the trace deletion hypothesis, the trace will eventually be deleted. So what happens here is that this is the final construction of the subject relative clause. It happens the boy that kisses the girl. So when there is a trace actually, all right, like I told you earlier, the TDH actually, according to TDH, grammatic patients will eventually use a default strategy to understand or to make their sentences to make sure that they could possibly understand the sentence. So what's the default strategy? The default strategy is that they would be appointing the first NP that they see as an agent. So which means the boy that they see actually eventually belongs to an agent. So when they appoint the boy as an agent, automatically their ability to guess, their level of understanding in selecting the best picture that corresponds to this sentence structure will be, will definitely be on the right sentences or be on the right picture, because as you know, the boy actually, that is being appointed as an agent who is the doer of the so-called action can eventually be pointed out by the agrammatic patient. On the other hand, when you look at the object relative clause, okay, the same thing, when there is a trace being left out, right? Okay, for this case, actually, if you see, right, the default strategy is being used, but then in this case, the girl that the boy kisses, actually, here the patient will eventually will not be able to guess these sentences correctly, the pictures correctly, because the first NP that they see, all right, by right, this is supposed to be the team, the receiver of the action, okay, but here when the agrammatic patient appoints the first NP as an agent, automatically their answers will be wrong. So when you see the OVS and SVO, all right, when the default strategy that is being used, agent as the first NP, all right, they manage to go about understanding the sentence structure accordingly, and they fall under the above chance. But when they, as for OVS, all right, the structure, there is a movement. When you see the girl, all right, okay, when there is a movement, actually, all these traces will eventually be deleted, and it is situated, the object is situated at the subject position, all right? This will eventually make them to have confusion, and they will eventually be guessing, and that is where they will basically assign the first NP that they see as an agent. So in this case, if you see OVS, most of the sentence structures, they attempt pointing at the wrong picture. So this leads to their, basically, their score is very much lower compared to the subject relative clauses, all right? And they fall under the chance performance level, right? Okay. So in conclusion, it is very much important to note that Grotzinski's 1990 TDH assumes that individuals with a grammatic aphasia suffer from a representational deficit. Okay, so these sentence representations are damaged because the traces are lost. Okay, so they cannot identify the traces. The traces will eventually be deleted, and this will eventually make them to apply the default strategy indicated in the TDH. So when they apply this strategy, this can only be relevant for a construction of internal structure that has an arrangement of SVO, because S is the subject, the doer of the action. But when we do that for OVS or OSV, all right, the first NP that they see is an object. So when they do that, automatically the first role that they assign to the OVS and OSV will be an agent, and automatically a grammatic patient will be pointing out at a very at a different picture, and they won't be able to understand the sentence structure overall. So the findings of this study actually supports Grotzinski's TDH, and his standard norm does correspond with the patient's performance overall. Okay, in both subject relative clause and also object relative clause, it can be clearly seen that both subject relative and object relative falls under the above chance and chance level respectively. So given that only syntactic difference between OSV, object relative clause, and SVO is the syntactic movement, this result actually provides a strong claim that movement is impaired. When there is a movement, they automatically delete the trace, where they would not be able to know that there was a movement actually, and they will eventually use the default strategy and simply guess the so-called sentence structure. So in order to have a better understanding about the nature of deficits in the grammatic comprehension, more cross-linguistic studies on language with word order properties are certainly needed to provide more empirical evidence to test the validity of the prediction from these linguistically based hypotheses or models or framework that is available out there. All right, I think that is all from me. These are some of the references that I have basically used to go about making my claims and assumptions and also discussion strong. And yeah, that is all from me. Thank you.